Hello, I'm Paul Gates. Welcome to this week's episode of The Academics. Joining me today are our regular panelists, Professor Heather Page Preston and Dr. Dave Spiceland. This week we'll be discussing one of the most influential bands of all time. From the 60s to today, the Beatles have remained a well-known group that almost every generation still listens to. So, to start off, well, let me first say that I am in the presence of two real experts who will really be filling up the time in our show today, but I'll be doing a lot of listening. What accounts for the longevity of the Beatles and the popularity even now, 50-some years later?
It's good music. It was different. However, it was recycled American rock and roll to a great extent. Well, with the exception of when Harrison got into the
sitar.
The sitar,
Yeah,
and we've both been at the, not the same time, but we've been to the restaurant that was in the movie Help, and
yeah,
where he
absolutely.
first was influenced by it. And that was the thing, is it wasn't like these four guys were sitting around saying, gee, how do we change the world? They were being influenced by a lot of things that they recycled back. It's like when Mick Jagger, you know, if you would ask him, where did you get your R&B interest? Mississippi and Alabama. So they just took a lot of us and they threw it right back at us. And they had the long hair. They had all of those things that our parents hated. I remember the Ed Sullivan Show where everybody's laughing, they won't last longer than, you know, and
They're laughing into their hats now.
they're laughing all the way to the bank.
Yeah, not only have they lasted, they've lasted with a vengeance. Back in 2000, to kind of commemorate 30 years after the breakup, the official dissolution of the band, they released the album One, on CD and vinyl, and it went #1. It was a collection of their #1 singles, UK, US singles. And it went to #1 in 36 or 37 countries. I can't remember exactly which. It is the 4th best-selling album in the US since Nielsen started tracking in 2004. And that was 4 years after its release they started tracking it. And it is the 6th best-selling album in the 21st century in the UK. So it not only competes with contemporary music. This is a band that last performed together live in 1969. It not only competes with contemporary music, it knocks the socks off of it most of the time.
Yeah, that's
amazing.
that's the interesting part, is that after the breakup, and it's hard to believe that was 1969.
Yeah, they last recorded together.
And
69, early 70s, something like that.
70 was the lawsuit.
And we're talking 48 years now, almost.
Yeah.
And of course, you know, you have to compare that to one of the contemporaries like the Rolling Stones, who are, of course, still
touring.
performing.
Yeah,
So no wonder they're still popular.
And Paul and Ringo are still performing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what's the R&B? Did you mention, Dave, as being
Rhythm
one of
and
the sources?
blues, you know, a lot of things that in our culture we kind of went, you know, and then they went, hey, you know, I like that.
That happens a lot in the UK, I've noticed. Even folks like local Doc Watson. I've been waiting for a Paul McCartney concert in the queue in Liverpool, talking to people who went to university in Liverpool about Doc Watson. When they found out he lived down the road from here, they were amazed. It's like, you know Doc Watson? It's like, well, yeah, actually, I have met him. And yeah, and that totally floored me. How do you know about Doc Watson should be the question, right? And even though he's Grammy Award winning, it's not, we don't think of it as the status of popular music. And the Beatles' influence is so far reaching. It's not just the music. It's culture, and I love that you said they took our music, repackaged it, and brought it back. That's exactly what happened, but they did it in a uniquely British style. Obviously, their influences from growing up, a lot of them were American, but obviously they had their own. Paul McCartney's insertion of dancehall music, the vaudeville style music into the Beatles' music. And then, you know, as they grew and went farther abroad, you had George Harrison's influence of Indian culture. Creeping into the music, and of course that influenced contemporary bands and bands after.
Well, and if you listen to rock and roll, 61, 62, 63, and it's kind of like that scene in Animal House where the guy is playing on the stairs.
The classical guitar.
And then what's his face? John Belushi takes the guitar and smashes him. I think that's what the Beatles did. Was our music was so boring.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but that's just my own point of view.
Well,
It was
here's the thing. I'm a second generation fan. So listening to that time period, I'm going, man, y'all were hard up for entertainment. No wonder the Beatles were popular. Because you had topping the charts when the Beatles came to the U.S. in '64, the singing nun doing her French song.
Dominique.
Yes, that's it, Dominica, yes.
Right,
So,
right.
yeah, that's what was on the top of the charts. So when the Beatles get here and you have Can't Buy Me Love, right? They had the top 4 singles in
Yeah.
April of '64. The top 4 slots on the charts in '64. It was amazing.
But you know the thing about the '60s, because I love to listen to the '60s on 6. Not a commercial plug, but there were, you know, Frank Sinatra's doing "Slowly as I Leave You" and "Softly as I Leave You" and all these songs that the oldsters could listen to. In fact, when "Everybody Loves Somebody" came out, and Dean Martin's son was a big Beatles fan, and in fact, Dean Martin did not want to record that, and of course became very successful. And he told his son, he said, "I'm about to knock your 4 buddies off the charts," and he did, because there was still an older.
Listening demographic.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but the Beatles were beginning to make those changes. And in fact, just to give a clue to the folks in the back, I do have something in just a second I'm going to show. Can I do it right now, or can they let you know if it's okay?
Go
Or-
for it.
this is something which is the holy grail to Beatle fans. I don't know if you can see this or not. But this is a nondescript album, Yesterday and Today, which was a repackage.
What, was this their first album?
No. This was a lot of stuff that Capitol said, well, let's shave this off of the British albums coming over. And by the way, there was a difference between Dave Dexter was a guy who was the A&R guy for Capitol Records, and he's not very much loved by Beatle fans for a lot of different reasons. So they would take the music and they put channel some sort of echo effect to it or whatever. See, and that's what's going on there. This album, which was not the first, but it had all of these hits. I know you can't see this. but
Earlier hits.
Earlier
yeah.
hits that they thought
65.
they'd make some more money off of, which some say this was the Beatles reacting to that. So I bought this at a store for something like $2, and I, not very well, but I unpasted the front off of, and if you can see this, in some regards, this can be worth thousands of dollars. Probably not this one. But people who have bought, in fact, this was one that the Capitol Records took off the market. And this was the unique thing. There's so many unique things going on with the Beatles in terms of the packaging and how Capitol Records was.
We're going to have a hard time containing this today. There's so many different directions you can go. Yeah.
Do it online, who knows? And then, and I'm not sure if I'm allowed to do this, but this is the Beatles, Meet the Beatles in Japanese. Or actually it's in Japan, it was the same recording. And it just shows the worldwide influence
It does.
that they had.
In fact, one of the stories that I tell in Mass Media and Society when we talk about popular culture impact worldwide, and particularly American popular culture impact, is I was at a party one time and it was full of Japanese exchange students. And we did that uncomfortable stand around and nod and smile at each other. We didn't know how to break the ice. So what I did was I had enough. I went over, my friend had a wonderful vinyl collection, pulled out a Beatles because I know the Japanese market is the second largest market for Beatles, put it on, all but one student came over and we had halting exchanges of language, but we communed over the Beatles. It was amazing. It was an amazing cultural moment.
But it seems to me, what might have spurred that was, it seems to me that the Beatles really did world tours.
They
Yeah.
did.
Quite extensively.
They did.
At the worst was '66.
Yes.
I mean, that's when it all fell
The
apart.
worst?
Yes.
The worst.
Yeah.
That was when they were in Japan, I'm sorry, the Philippines, and
Imelda Marcos invited them to a tea. They didn't know about it. They got escorted to the plane. And there's this great clip of John Lennon explaining how they got escorted. And he said, yes, they forced us out and they're pushing us and
Oh,
shoving us.
yeah.
And he said they kept saying, "You're ordinary passenger, you're ordinary passenger." And he said, "Is this how you treat your ordinary passengers?" Yeah, well, they were not happy. They didn't think they were going to be allowed to leave the Philippines.
well, George Harrison was asked, where are you going to now? And the next place was going to be the United States. And so somebody said, where are you going to now? And he said, we're going to America to get beat up by the Americans, which is kind of a private joke. But I'll tell you my experience internationally. I was at Goom's department store in Moscow. Moscow, years ago, 82, I guess. And I walked into a record shop. And I thought, oh, I'll get some Beatles records. So I walked in and I said, do you have any Beatles? And her eyes lit up. She said, Niet's Beatles, Niet's Beatles. I said, you got any Paul McCartney? Niet's Paul McCartney. And this is during the Soviet era.
Yeah.
And they had Brezhnev Speaks and, you know, Lenin's last words or whatever.
But
no Beatles.
Were not allowed, no.
Yeah.
In fact, but the market was still there, obviously. So they smuggled in the recordings via X-rays. Yes.
Via X-ray.
Via X-rays.
Go figure.
Yes, yes.
A little different than smuggling jeans, which was the other
Yes,
thing that was
yeah,
smuggled in
yeah.
those days.
Absolutely, yeah.
Wow.
That's
Yeah.
amazing. And since
bet.
then, Paul's played Petersburg. Okay, so yeah, he's played.
Live at Red Square or
Yes,
whatever.
yeah.
Yeah, and look how then official opposition, both in the Philippines and in Russia, didn't seem to make much of a dent.
No.
Not at all. In fact, it made them more popular.
I
Yeah,
guess that was-
It's kind of a power of the people, you know,
Yes,
in many ways.
it truly is. You know, the Beatles also stood for the most part, good things. They sang about love a lot. They talked about everyday things. I mean, there's a song, Paperback Writer, for Pete's sake. People can relate to the pop culture imagery they put in. They also pushed the imagery envelope like many groups did in 66 into 67. They lost some followers when they switched their sound, but they gained a whole new following as well.
Kind of like Bob Dylan when he went electric, you
Yeah,
know, in
absolutely.
the 67 era, something like that. But you know, the technology, we could do a whole couple of
Absolutely.
on the technology, but they were doing 2-track recordings where they would ping pong the tracks back and forth. And that's why the early recordings were not in stereo. They would mix it mono. The first, take out your pencils here, the first,
Give me a test later.
that's right. First 4-track recording was I Want to Hold Your Hand. And from there, the technology increased. If you listen to an early version of some of the songs, and there's one song where there's a tape dropout. In fact, it's not a tape dropout. It's something to where there was a glitch, and they purposely did something to where on Day Tripper, there's on the chorus something missing. But on one, they went back and they fixed a lot of the things
did.
on one.
They did.
And one of the last things before they retired, if you will, from being a group is they said, do not change our recordings. Our recordings have to stay the same. And that was fairly true. George Martin had remixed some things and was careful about it because he didn't want to get in trouble with the boys, who are all still alive. But the technology changed to where by Abbey Road they had 16-track recordings.
Yeah, but
before
Sgt.
digital.
Pepper was done on 4, correct?
Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
Sgt. Pepper, which is
Yeah.
the seminal record, if you want to think of it that way, is truly a miracle. They pioneered so many different engineering techniques. Abbey Road's engineers were constantly having to realize the Beatles' vision by refiguring things. Paperback Writer, I mentioned. The bass on Paperback Writer, that was one of the first songs, or maybe the first single, where the bass was, you could actually hear it. It sounded like a bass like we think of it today. Had some oomph to it. Paul switched from playing his Hofner bass to a Rickenbacker bass. And then, instead of recording through a microphone, the policy was to put a microphone in front of the bass amp and record it. That way, there were no direct inputs. They didn't use them for the Beatles. They existed, but they didn't use them for the Beatles. They changed the policy. Jeff Emmerich, the head engineer, said, you know, basically a loudspeaker is a microphone wired in reverse or vice versa. So why don't we record through a loudspeaker? It can record the bottom end better than a microphone can, which was getting the higher pitched instruments. And that's how they got the heavier sound.
And Jeff
are
Emmerich.
these Capitol engineers? Is that
No. These are Abbey
No.
Road and EMI.
Oh, this is
EMI
after?
is the
Okay.
parent
And they
company,
were
so at Abbey Road
very
Studios, yes.
Prim and proper.
Oh, yes, they were.
They wrote up on Revolution, of course, whichever revolution it was, but it was so distorted, which they wanted purposely,
Yeah.
but they got written up because they didn't follow proper procedures for Abbey Road.
The engineers would show up in suit coats, ties, and lab coats over top of that to record. Yes.
But
Abbey Road engineers.
Abbey
Yes,
Road.
Abbey Road.
Now, here's my ignorance. which came first, the album Abbey Road or the label
Much
Abbey
later.
Road?
Well, Abbey Road was the place.
Yeah, it's not a label. It's
Yeah.
it's a place. The Beatles actually were released on EMI's label Parlophone in the UK, and then Capitol picked them up here in the US. So that's where the Capitol connection comes in.
And I
Yeah.
think both of us have been to, not at the same time, but we've been to Abbey Road and walked across the zebra crossing.
course.
Of course.
I mean, every good Beatles fan
You must.
does that.
You must.
And but there's
It's in the
there's-
handbook.
Well, and if you look at abbeyroad.com/crossing, you can see a live feed
Webcam.
with audio. It's a webcam.
Yeah.
And you can see
Yes.
people there in the middle of the night crossing the road.
And that reminds me, the first time I got to go, I was with my mother, and she didn't want to go. She said, "We're going to be the only two fools walking across Abbey Road. If we
No.
brought up the webcam now, day and night there are people taking pictures trying to recreate the cover."
And it's weird because they drive on the wrong side of the road.
That's not wrong for them.
I know. I'm just, but you know, there is a problem in London in particular, I've
Oh, yeah.
seen, where it'll say look right, because a lot of Americans figure
they
that
do
the
left,
traffic.
right, left, yeah.
So you have to be careful over there.
Have you been on the Yellow Submarine?
No, no.
Only in your mind.
I just had to ask.
That's okay.
Yeah, but it's funny you mentioned crossing. It's one of the things I tell students when I do the Beatles study abroad is, folks, you have to understand you are not at home. There's a whole nother way of being, and one of those is looking a different way to cross the street.
right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Danger comes first from the right.
Yeah, sure
That's
does.
right, yeah.
And by the way, Jeff Emmerich has written a great book
Oh, yes.
about and the thing about the Beatles, I love the Beatles, I love what they did in many ways, but he just got tired of, in fact, he said, during the White Album, he said, "You guys are giving me a nervous breakdown." And he walked away from engineering until the last album, until Abbey Road. He's given a prominent
Yeah.
place in Beatle lore.
Turns out during the recording of the White Album, they were giving each other nervous breakdowns.
Oh.
So yeah, that's where it really truly fell apart.
Well, it's kind of like Oobla Dee Oobla Da. They had done like 30 different takes, and they hated the three of them except McCartney hated the song. In fact, if you hear "Lend Her a Hand," and then you can hear John and George say "arm,"
Yeah, they
hand
snuck
or
in
whatever.
little things.
But they didn't know how to open it. So Lennon, who was a little lit this day, came in and said, "I got it." Sat down at the piano, went dun 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 dun,
Dun, dun,
and
dun,
that's
dun.
the opening to at least the
Starting
commercial
on the
version.
bass line.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
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 And if people are really interested in the recording history of the Beatles and the different tracks and what's on the different tracks, really what you can do is go check out Mark Lewison's books.
Yes.
He is considered the expert. He's in phase 2, or he's writing volume 2 of what will be essentially the definitive biography of the Beatles. Volume 1 is a huge number of pages for the commercial release, and then there's a kind of director's cut, a writer's release, which added another couple 300 pages to it. Yeah, and that's just up through 1961. They're just on the cusp of going to London to record. It's amazing how much detail he's gone into.
Is he a former music critic for the New York Times?
Mark
Or-
Lewison?
or
No,
might-
that was Alan Kozin.
Ah.
Yeah, Alan Kozin worked for the New York Times and was a classical music critic, and he's a big Beatles fan as well.
Has
Yeah.
he written on the Beatles
Oh,
since?
yes, absolutely. He's got a book, I can't remember the press that it's out on, but he has a book about the instrumentation in their music. Very, very good book, yeah, very detailed.
I see. So
He's written some other things as well.
he's talking about the Beatles, then their technique, not
Yes.
not the backstory that
He's classically trained musician, and yeah.
I see.
And the media hasn't always gotten it right. I mean,
No.
Rolling Stone was not very kind to Abbey Road, when it came out. And,
Who was it? Lester Bangs? Lester somebody who really hated Sgt. Pepper.
See, that's the point. We don't know who these people
Yeah,
are.
yeah. Who are you when you're at home? Yeah,
Yeah.
because I know who the Beatles are.
That's the point. We know the Beatles, but
Yes.
we don't know these small people who said terrible things about.
Who are experts in their own field,
Yeah.
right? But in pop culture memory,
Well,
yeah.
in pop culture, they don't rise to the surface. I mean, whatever criticism they have of the Beatles
Yeah.
is overshadowed by the stature of the band themselves.
Yeah,
And-
absolutely.
And again, even today, 48 years after their last appearance.
Yes, and you talk about their impact. You just do a Google feed for news stories, and use keywords like a day in the life. You may or may not be surprised how many articles have that phrase in the title. It creeps into reporters' writing. I mean, the mass media impact is amazing, absolutely amazing.
And we haven't talked much about the lyrics. And the lyrics, for instance, when Paul and John used to write together, so Paul had the idea, she was only 17, she could have been a beauty queen. And Lennon went, no. And he said, make it more abstract. And that was a very key element there. She was just 17, you know what I mean. And of course, my parents would have said, oh, what does that mean? Well, I don't know.
Can't be listening to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So looks like we're almost out of time. But
We are almost out of time.
Dang it.
We're going to
How'd
change
that
it up a little
happen?
bit this week. And Dave, you're going to take us out.
Well, and to close up the show this week, Professor Heather Page Preston will be giving us a fun fact about the history of the Beatles.
The Beatles are known for their love of wordplay, as you might have gathered from what we've just talked about. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was inspired by a discussion that Paul McCartney and the Beatles' roadie Mal Evans had about packets of salt and pepper. Salt and pepper became Sgt. Pepper, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Wow. Well, that's the time that we've got for today. I'm Dave Spiceland. We hope that you'll join us next week, the same time on The Academics.